Alrighty, welcome to the second of our two lessons on soil. We're going to talk about the composition of soil, meaning the different particles that make it up, and their properties and how that affects the properties of soil in general. One of the very important things about soil is how much water it can hold, otherwise known as its water holding capacity, which depends on a few things. It depends on different soil types, which we're going to talk about as we go through this lesson. And water retention is important because soil that can retain water is going to be more productive and is probably going to be more fertile because it's not as dependent on recent precipitation in order to be able to support plants. Water holding capacity is dependent on a couple of things, one of which is porosity, which measures how many empty spaces there are in a substance. There is also permeability, which is whether stuff can pass through. A substance in this case, whether water can pass through soil. It depends on the sizes of the pores. So let's write depends on pore size and whether they're connected. So we'll say connectivity. So if there are lots of pores, but they're not interconnected, water won't be able to pass through the soil and be able to get down deeper into the soil. If there are a few pores, but they're interconnected, that would increase the permeability of the soil. And there are a couple of terms involved with water moving through soil. Percolation is water moving into a porous substance, something with pores that allows it to pass. Infiltration is the movement of water down into soil. So it percolates into the soil and then it infiltrates down to deeper layers of the soil. This can be affected by same things that affect permeability, pore size, connectivity of the pores. It is also affected by soil compaction, as hopefully you are seeing in our soil lab. So when soil is compacted, that reduces the airspace and the connectivity of the pores, which reduces the ability of water to move through the soil. Later on, when we have more conversations about agriculture and how soil affects our ability to grow plants, one of the things we'll talk about that's a threat to the ability to grow plants on land and be able to grow crops is soil compaction. So it's going to come back to as a topic that we're going to revisit. So soil is composed of a number of things. It's got minerals of different sizes. That's all these different particles that you see here. So these are each minerals. Some of them might be sand, some of them might be silt, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Then there's organic material, which is an important part of soil. It makes soil fertile and allows for plants to be able to take nutrients very easily. And then there are open spaces. Open spaces are very important for soil because they allow air to be in the pore spaces, which is important for plants to be able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, even in their root cells. It's also important because you have a lot of microorganisms that live in the soil and help contribute to the productivity and the fertility of a soil, and they need those air spaces in order to get their own oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. And then those open spaces, if they're filled with water, are also important because then those soil particles can help retain the water in the soil so that way it doesn't just run off or run through down to groundwater, which we'll talk about more when we talk about land and water use. So, the size of the particles, the material that make up these particles, and how these are arranged into different soil horizons, like we talked about in the previous set of notes, is very important because it can affect the fertility of the soil. The different types of particles that you have in the soil are going to make up what we call the soil texture, which is the relative amount of the different particles of sand, silt, or clay. And so these are the major components, including gravel as well. And so each of these particle types have different characteristic sizes, which we're going to look at on the next slide as well. Clay tends to be very tiny particles. It has a lot of surface area, so water can attach to these particles very easily, and it's got very high water retention. If you have clay soil, you're going to have less runoff. However, there is a downside to having a large amount of clay in your soil in that it tends to get waterlogged and it doesn't allow water to run through very quickly. Sandy soil, which is at the other extreme, tends to have the largest particle size. There's not as much surface area for water to accumulate, and it doesn't tend to hold on to water very well. So, sandy soil will have the highest levels of runoff, which Can be good, can be bad. If you're trying to retain water in an area and you are not getting high levels of precipitation, then sandy soil could be a downside because then water will run off or water will infiltrate and get into groundwater, and then you're going to need to rely heavily on incoming precipitation. We're going to talk about different mixtures of soil, and we're going to talk about how loam is actually the ideal soil mix, in that it has a mix of different particle sizes, which means it kind of has the best of all these different worlds. It has these small clay particles that can help hold on to water, and it has these larger sandy particles that will allow water to run through, so water won't kind of stick around and the soil won't get waterlogged. So if you're ever trying to farm, your ideal soil is usually going to be loam, which we'll talk about more in a minute. So these different soil particles, starting from smallest to largest, are clay, which is so tiny that on this image right here, you can't even see it. It's too small. It compacts very easily and it forms these large, dense clumps when it's wet, has very high water holding capacity. So if you have a crop that needs to hold on to lots of water, you might want to have a lot of clay in the soil. Like I said, it becomes easily waterlogged, meaning it is soaked with water. The next larger size of particle is silt. Silt is very fine, but not as fine as clay. It feels kind of like if you're holding flour. So if you, with your parents' permission, of course, go home. If you've got like a jar or a bag of flour, dip your hand in it, feel the texture. That's the texture of what silt feels like. Clay, though, is very fine. It feels almost silky. Silt is mostly a sedimentary material. It's easily carried by water, so it's going to be very commonly found in riverbeds or in floodplains. Sand is larger than clay or silt. It's fairly coarse. It's kind of the stuff that, of course, think of it as sand like from a beach, but it's also large enough particles that you should be able to start to see them a little with the naked eye. So they're larger, coarser than silt. It tends to feel gritty and it allows water to pass through very easily. Now, before you think, oh, sand is terrible for growing crops because it lets water pass through so easily, there are actually some types of crops that do need to grow in sandy soil, which I was surprised myself to learn. For example, onions need to grow in sandy soil. They can't get waterlogged or they start to rot. And then there's usually some small chunks of gravel, small bits of rock mixed in with soil. These are usually bits of the parent material that haven't fully broken down yet. Another key characteristic of soils or key component of soils is humus, not humus. Humus is a food that's made of ground chickpeas. Humus is organic matter that's been mostly decomposed. It's probably not going to be broken down by decomposers in the area as much, but it is readily available for plants to take up. So, humus is a key component of soil because it allows for fertility and allows for plants to grow easily because they can take up nutrients very easily in this form. It tends to be high in organic carbon. It's usually black or dark brown, so soil that is rich and fertile, which tends to have a higher humus content, will tend to be black or dark brown. You might hear about people talking about, rich black earth. That's what they mean. It increases all these properties that are going to be good for when you're trying to grow crops or when you're trying to have plants grow in an area. So things like water retention, fertility of the soil, nutrient ions, so that way you don't have to add fertilizer, and the growth of beneficial microbes. Remember, bacteria are not always harmful. We, for example, need those nitrogen fixing bacteria to be living in an area. And you also want bacteria that are decomposers to live in soil as well. So I said we'd talk about loam. Loam is a mixture of clay, silt, sand, and humus, and it is equal parts of a mixture of them. It tends to have a higher nutrient content, and it's, like I said, good at retaining water without becoming so soaked that things start to mold or fungus starts to grow. This is in general the best soil for growing crops, but like I said, that's a generalization. There's some crops that might require higher clay content or higher sand content. It just depends. So, how do we figure out soil texture? Well, there is a test to do that, and this is something we are going to do in one of our labs in class. So, I thought I'd describe the procedure here. You take a sample of soil, you mix it with water and a little bit of detergent, you shake it up, and then you let the soil particles settle. what's generally going to happen is the heaviest particles will settle first onto the bottom. And so the heaviest particle that's usually found in soil is going to be sand. So sand settles to the bottom. Just above that, you will have a layer of silt settle. And then at the very top, you'll have a small layer of clay. You will be able to see visually the difference between these layers. And what you can do is calculate the height of each layer and then calculate what percentage of the total height of that soil sample. So in this case, the height of the solids, you would take the height of, say, the clay and divide it by the height of the solids and get a percentage of your soil sample that's made of clay. You do the same thing for the height of the silt layer and the height of the sand layer. Then you use something called a soil texture triangle, and you use that to determine what type of soil you have. This can be important if you're a farmer because depending on the type of soil you have in an area, you can grow different crops. Like I said, some crops may require sandier soil, some may require more clay heavy soil. And so knowing what type of soil texture you have allows you to better kind of grow your crops and adapt your crops to the area. Also can be helpful because if you need to modify your soil to allow you to grow different crops, then that's possible too. You can buy clay and silt and sand and mix it into your soil. So I think that's a lot more practical for someone who's growing a garden, for example, rather than a full-on farm, because that would be a large amount of material to move. So here is a soil texture triangle, and I'm going to go over how to use it. We're going to use that picture from the previous slide as an example, and I did an estimate. I estimated that this thing is 50% sand. Then I estimated about 40% silt and about 10% clay. Now, I know that you may disagree with these estimates. You may want to take a ruler to your screen and figure this out. But the important thing to note is that all of these percentages have to add up to 100 because altogether, these make up total 100% of the sample or 100% of the solids. But what's important to note is what percent is sand, what percent is silt, and what percent is clay. Then you use this soil texture triangle. I generally start with the percent clay on the left-hand side just because it's a little easier because all of the lines that extend directly out to the right represent, like this line represents something that's 90% clay. This line represents 80% clay. And then I am going to erase that because we're going to now look at what happens when we chart out the numbers that we came up with. So the amount of clay that we have is 10% clay. So I unmarked that first. So our soil type is going to be somewhere along this line. Now, how do we figure out where along this line it is? Well, we need to start drawing lines for the other types of soil particles. So next, I looked at the fact that there's 50% sand, and then there was 10% clay. And notice where these two mix is here in the loam area. And just to verify, I'm going to go ahead and draw my 40% silt line. So on over here on silt, that's 40%. And notice that line when it comes down intersects the other two. And where those three lines intersect, that tells me the type of soil I have. So if I was drawing a conclusion, I would say, okay, this is loam. So this nice happy drawing that I found online happened to show you a loamy example of soil. And then that's only one of a number of tests that you can run. You can run various tests to test the chemical and the physical properties of soil. This allows you to make decisions like, how do I irrigate? If I have a very easily waterlogged soil, I may not have to water as often, but I may have to make sure that water drains properly. And then it can also help you decide what fertilizer requirements you have. A few of the major things that you test are pH. If the pH is too low and the soil is too acidic, certain plants won't grow. So you can do something like adding lime, for example, which is this white stuff up here. This is lime. Not lime like, limon like the fruit. Lime is a chemical that can increase your pH of your soil and therefore make it easier for certain crops to grow. also can test for multiple different types of soil nutrients. And you can test to see if they're in a plant available form, meaning are they in a form that plants can easily take up? Because it doesn't matter if you have a ton of phosphorus in your soil. If it's not in a form that plants can take up easily through their roots, then to plants it's going to be as if there's no phosphorus there whatsoever. And so knowing if you have plant available varieties of all of these different types of nutrients lets you know, do you need to add some of these nutrients? And if so, then you can add them in a fertilizer mix. All right. So, hopefully, with that knowledge of soil, we can start to talk about how to grow plants when we get to Unit 5, which is coming up next, and we talk about agriculture.